Wes Craven is a filmmaker who was able to catch lightning in a bottle twice. First with The Nightmare on Elm Street in the 80s, and not too long after that, Scream in the late 90s, scoring major franchises for both, placing him in the legacy of the slasher film genre twice in one lifetime. This does not happen often. What also doesn't happen often is being able to bring something new to a film genre in one lifetime either. Freddy was the first slasher to bend the rules on what a slasher can truly be by making him a full-blown supernatural entity. With Scream, he decided to take on meta-storytelling to really bring the audience in. A good example of this is when Drew Barrymore was assumed to have been the final girl of the film because of her celebrity status and recognition in Hollywood, but to the audience's surprise and dismay, was taken out in the opening. Another way that Scream took on meta-storytelling was through the storytelling itself. A lot of people assume that he was taking a shot at slasher films and the tropes that come with them, but I don't know. I feel like I saw something different. Walk with me, talk with me, as I discuss what I feel was really meta about Wes Craven's Scream and why I feel audiences may have got it all wrong. Don't start typing in them comments without watching the whole video. We're skipping to the end? Yes, we are. The reveal with Billy and Stu is a very telling reveal to me through their monologue. The reason why I believe that Billy and Stu are a representation of the audience is because throughout the film, the rules are forced upon the characters by them. I feel Billy and Stu are a representation on how the audience can be a bit too critical of slasher films at times and have a pre-existing bias towards them. The rules don't come naturally, and what I mean by that is if you truly watch slasher films, you'll realize how these tropes and bias were built through the audience's point of view and film buffs, and over time those became the rules and the tropes, but not what I feel was always present. So in turn, when slasher films started to pop off in the mainstream, that's how they were viewed. The audiences say this is what slashers contain, so this is what has to be in it, or it's not a slasher film, despite them not really liking these tropes and rules. I feel this isn't a stretch considering Wes Craven was known for bending the rules on what a slasher could be. Let's go rule by rule, presented in Scream by the character Randy, but before we do that, I want to point out another cool thing I noticed in this scene that I feel kind of backs up my point when it comes to how audiences can be too critical towards slasher films. Randy and his friends are watching Halloween, and one of the characters complains about the blood being too red, which I feel reveals that though he's enjoying the film, he's watching through a judgmental know-it-all lens, especially when during the time of Halloween, filmmakers who make the blood look a little bit lighter usually do that to avoid a harsh rating from the MPAA, though it can also be done for stylistic choices. I mean, look at how they rated Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the most blood you saw in that film was on the character of Sally at the end of the film. So I feel it shows how the audience can be too harsh on a film at times without considering the filmmakers and how difficult it is to actually get a film made and in front of audiences. I mean, it's a film after all, and not all films are going to be completely realistic, and that's okay because it's a film. Another character even said how the film was predictable, and my question to that is, if it's so predictable, then why watch? We as humans feel this need to have a bit of an ego and superiority complex sometimes. So even if we think all slasher films are predictable, we still watch just to say, I knew it. Honestly, I can be guilty of judging a film too harshly as well when it comes to watching films from time to time, but let's learn together. Another thing that I feel represents this is how Stu is taken out in this very room. He is taken out when Cindy smashes his head with the TV, and playing on that TV is Halloween. I take that as the film saying, forget you, to the overall critical audience of slasher films, because Stu was taken out by the very thing he refused to allow to exist outside of the rules and tropes he had learned. But I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself, so on to the rules.
For instance, number 1, you can never have...
It's also really associated with the final girl because the trope is that final girls never have X in horror films, and because of that, they survive. However, I can think of multiple times where the final girl, who was supposed to represent innocence, in quotations, was written into the story to have X or had already had X. 2 off the top of my head are Jenny from Friday the 13th Part 2 and Jess from Black Christmas, released in 1974. Just because we don't see the X happening doesn't mean it didn't, and I feel implications count. Now, is that to say that slasher films don't use the death of characters who had X to say, hey, you have X, you die? No. However, I feel it's not presented with the assumptions that come with slasher films. Even when you look at the entire film of Black Christmas, not one character has X on screen, yet they are all taken out in the film. So that rule is commonly broken. And I know you're ready to say, well, every single rule and trope doesn't apply to every single slasher and horror film. However, just hear me out and let me finish.
Okay, number 2, you can never drink or do drugs.
One of the most well-known final girls, Laurie Strode, literally smokes a thick one in the car with her friend Annie. I also feel the perfect example is right in the film because all of them were drinking and doing drugs, yet they all lived and survived.
And number 3, never ever say, I'll be right back.
Once again, that rule is literally broken in this film because Stu is the slasher, so he will be right back. Also, I feel like my point can also be seen during the scene because if you think about all the slasher films and what female characters are usually partaking in the color nude, it's usually the secondary characters like the friends or the camp counselors, not the final girl. There were no female characters in this film that had X outside of Sydney or partook in the color nude. I'll break that point down a bit more in the upcoming section of this video. Also, despite Randy supposedly being the smart one and breaking down the rules in the film, he broke one rule that he didn't mention in the film, and that's to never split up. He saw everyone leave and flop right back on the couch, and to dive even deeper into that part, Randy didn't die. That's usually what happens when a character is left alone after being separated. Yet Randy lived and was only in danger when he followed the rules, aka when he came back into the house to surround himself with friends. I feel like with this, Wes Craven is constantly reminding the audience to stop trying to apply bias and rules to the film and just enjoy it, because you won't be able to predict what happens next by using those same biases and rules. Throughout this film, the common tropes in slasher films are broken and then forcefully maintained by Billy and Stu, and I feel that's to show the audience that slashers and horror films aren't as one note as we assume them to be. For example, Tatum didn't go get those beers on her own accord. Stu asked her to go get them to separate her from the group, despite the fact that there was no sign of them running out of beer. I would understand if she did it on her own, but no, it was influenced by one of the slashers of the film once again. Also, I love how in this scene, it's subtly hinted that Stu is one of the slashers by the way he trips over the couch, because Ghostface is really clumsy, but that's only something you'll catch if you watch it multiple times. But to continue, Billy and Stu are the metaphor for the audience who says, hey, here are the tropes of slasher films that we don't like, but if you try to break them, then you can't consider yourself a slasher or a horror film. So we're going to enforce them, and we control when the tropes count and when they don't. I.e. Billy constantly trying to convince Sydney to have X with him throughout the film despite her wanting to wait because it's not a horror film and she can't die if she's a virgin, despite me disproving that trope earlier. And Stu saying I'll be right back after Randy warned the people watching not to say that because, well, they won't be right back, but that doesn't apply to Stu because he controls the narrative and he knows the tropes of the horrifying horror film fantasy he's making with Billy. He controls who lives and who dies. He controls what counts as a trope and what doesn't. The goalpost constantly moves when it comes to the tropes and rules of slasher and horror films, and the rules and tropes are very broad. I mean, it happens, but could these just be mere coincidences and not actual tropes that are enforced by the genre itself, especially during the time of this film's release? But when it comes to rules, they are usually commonly enforced, and the literal definition of a trope is a significant or recurring theme or motive. But what happens if it's not as recurring as we remember? So then, is it truly a trope if most of the female leads who fall under the final girl trope break that trope in some way, shape, or form? Like it said that final girls are seen as smart and able to get out of the situations because, well, they're a virgin and they don't smoke and drink, and yet anytime I see a final girl on screen survive in the best way she can, someone's complaining about what she didn't do or what she should have done or how a decision was a dumb decision. It feels really contradictory. Are the final girls smart or are they dumb? But like I said, I'll break that down a bit more in the upcoming section of this video. Even in the ending, the audience, Billy and Stu, want to control who the slasher is. But in the end, the audience suffers because they expect certain tropes, but they don't allow slasher films to expand beyond their perception, which in itself will lead to the disappointment of things not going their way and the metaphorical death, Billy and Stu's death. They'll always find a way to point out what the slasher and horror film and the characters did wrong and how it could have been more realistic, even placing the blame on the final girl from time to time, like how Billy blamed Sydney and her mom for his pain when ain't nobody tell his daddy to be a dirtbag and abandon his child. So the audience completely ruins their viewing experience of the film. You can even compare to how when certain people watch slasher films, they think they're smarter than the final girl or the group of survivors, saying how they should have did this or should have done that, and that they would be the survivors to tell the tale, just like Billy and Stu. But in the end, like I said, it would just lead to a metaphorical death because the audience is trying to control the narrative, because this is how slasher films go, or I would know what to do or how to survive, completely ruining their experience at the end of the day instead of just watching the movie. It's like the audience is competing with the film. Are there some horror films where there are obvious scenes where characters make certain decisions to move the plot forward? Yes. However, if the audience comes into a slasher and horror film with a certain expectation about every film, then we won't really be able to tell when these tropes actually do happen, kind of like a confirmation bias. To start off, I'm not calling the audience psychos, okay? I just really want to use this quote, but what I mean by this quote is that we as an audience love film. It's an art form that touches the most used senses out of the 5 of them: hearing and seeing. It's also an art form that impacts the most people, even people who aren't film buffs and have a passion for cinema, just a person who decided to go to the movies and watch a random film on a random afternoon. However, out of that, we get people who are passionate about film, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, it can become a problem, and you can become too passionate about something to the point where it turns into obsession. Then it no longer is an art form that you love and allowed to have imperfections, but an art form that you must see perfected on screen each and every time, or it's a waste. It completely ruins your experience, and you have to be able to turn off the film buff and return back to the person you were when you showed appreciation to the film you're watching, and just really enjoy it even if you feel it's not perfect. Don't be Billy and Stu. Slasher and horror films have long had a reputation for being misogynistic slop, which introduced the subgenre in horror of elevated/artsy horror. However, that has always been a genre I don't agree should exist, because just because a film's social commentary isn't at the forefront doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Child's Play, released in 1988, is literally a commentary on consumerism during the 1980s. But because of this reputation, it automatically creates a bias for the audience, and I feel that causes the audience to find things that aren't there sometimes. Like if I told you I definitely saw a spider in the bananas at our local grocery store, you would still buy the bananas. However, you would look through them, and rightfully so. You don't want to get attacked by a spider, but anything wrong with that said banana, like a little bit of fur, bruising, discoloration, could possibly become a confirmation bias, leading you to being in the store all day only looking for the perfect bananas, which you probably won't find. So the set of bananas that you feel the most comfortable buying. I hope that made sense. At the end, when Stu and Billy stab each other to show their commitment to the story that they curated, and going on about how there has to be a sequel, it can be seen as studios seeing the success of one film and wanting to keep it going, which is very true. However, we keep watching them because, well, at the end of the day, we love film. Let's be honest with ourselves. Anytime a slasher franchise comes out with another film, audiences line up to see their favorite slasher on screen again, whether that's to hate watch or to hopefully get some nostalgia from the previous film you saw. But at the end of the day, most of the time, and I say most of the time because there are other variables when it comes to releasing a film, a studio won't release another film unless it has some potential to make money. We go see it, so they keep releasing it. We go and we watch through the lens of our passion for cinema, making judgments about it, not even to be angry sometimes, but because we love film so much and we know what it can be. But like I said, that turns into obsession. And just like Billy and Stu, the audience is taking unnecessary stabs, aka damage, because we care too much to the point where it leaves you frustrated and angry, because y'all, we could literally not watch. Anytime a large studio puts out a sequel, we could genuinely just say, nah, I'm good, and save the $15 for another film we're interested in seeing. But no, we watch the sequel, and the one after that, and the one after that, because through that, obsession is hope that the film and franchise you care about will finally get everything right. But the honest truth is, if we continue to come into slashers and horror films with that inherent bias and picking at every little thing, we won't ever view the film as getting it right. The final girl wasn't always a badge of honor given to the lead in a slasher film. I feel it started off as a way to point out misogyny in the slasher genre until it wasn't. Wes Craven is credited for reinventing the final girl with the character of Sydney Prescott, having her and other female characters in the film put them paws up from time to time when trying to escape the slashers of the film. But what if I told you that the final girl trope had holes in it from the beginning and that the storytelling was always the problem? Because in my opinion, I haven't seen many final girls that have taken on the role of being the damsel in distress as much as we think they do. They always find a way to fight back on their terms, but the complaints are usually that they don't square up with the killer and keep pouncing on them until they're dead. And honestly, I can't blame the audience for wanting that, considering how usually the women in slasher films who aren't the lead are treated as eye candy, body counts, or both at the same time. However, I feel that using the final girl as a way to get that point across is a bit misguided and gives the final girls themselves unrealistic expectations. For example, if the final girl is seeing all of her friends getting taken out by this one slasher, I feel that it's simply survival instincts that her main focus should be getting away, not trying to take out the slasher once and for all by constantly beating them over the head with something. I feel the only way for that to be realistic is if we get a franchise or a sequel where that same final girl returns and now she understands what kind of threat she's up against. And even then, the slasher would evolve by the time they see each other again. Also, expecting every final girl to be a master martial artist is wild. If that's not in the final girl's backstory, then it simply wouldn't make sense, and it would actually be distracting for the film because you would want an explanation as to how she could do a perfect armbar on the slasher. Even when thinking about the character of Sydney, she did what plenty of final girls did before her in slasher films. Do things to slow them down in the midst of a chase, including hitting the slasher and trying to get away. I'm also a firm believer in bravery having multiple faces. I like the fact that every final girl finds a way to live in their own way instead of just straight up physically fighting with the slasher of the film. Are there damsels in distress in the slasher genre? Yes. I'm not denying their existence. However, I am saying that because the audience can have a bit of a distorted view when it comes to the final girl, if she's not straight up fighting them, then it's whack. And I honestly don't think that's fair. There's no way y'all expect Sally to duke it out with Leatherface and the family after she had been traumatized by seeing what she saw in that house. And honestly, just in general, because have you seen Leatherface? And she was running for her life the whole time. No breaks, no water, no food, just running. Come on now. Now, as for the known tropes presented in the final girl archetype, I feel the goalpost moves too often for this to be the trope we think it is. I feel that's why it moved from being a trope to a badge of honor. Also, to expand on my point before I move on, I'm not saying final girls can't physically fight the slasher. However, I'm saying expecting that out of every single final girl is a bit unfair. Humans are much more complex than that. I mentioned before that when it comes to partaking in the color nude, the final girl usually doesn't partake because they're supposed to separate them from their counterparts and place her in a position to survive because she's the one with morals, in quotations. However, like I said before, I feel it becomes contradictory because there are female side characters within the slasher genre who have final girl written all over them, but they end up being taken out anyway. Two examples off the top of my head are Vera from Friday the 13th Part 3 and Jenna from Friday the 13th 2009 reboot. They both had the qualities of a final girl just like the final girl of those same films, yet they were taken out like the other female characters who exuded the opposite traits of a final girl. Jenna from the Friday the 13th reboot was kind, selfless, went against the Chad of their group on multiple occasions, and didn't drink or do drugs or have ex, yet she did not live. Saying they don't smoke or drink is not true, especially when you circle back around to Jenny from Friday the 13th, where she's at a literal bar with her friends drinking. I know you're probably wondering why I'm talking about the Friday the 13th franchise so much, but I'll explain in the upcoming section of this video. They were supposed to catch on to danger faster than the rest of the other characters, but in my opinion, if they did that, the credits would roll in 15 minutes, so that characteristic is contradicting itself on its own. Sarah from My Bloody Valentine of 1981 wouldn't have gone down into the mines for fun if that's the case. Anytime I hear someone say that a character isn't making smart decisions, most of the time that includes the final girl. I feel that's because we the audience can come into a slasher film with an automatic bias, which I can understand. However, we feel to see how cool and inspiring a final girl really is. Once again, am I saying that slasher films are perfect and depict every single woman on screen perfectly? No. Misogyny very much exists with plenty of films in the slasher genre, including some of our favorites. Do characters make decisions in some slasher films to move the plot forward from time to time? Yes. However, I feel maybe we should come with a bit bit more understanding when we view slasher films of the old and the new, because I feel we have misread the plot because of our biased view. Ooh, bars. And I'm finna prove it to you. Ooh. I feel this alone proves my point because everyone says Sydney changed the game for what a final girl can be, but why not Nancy? Nancy literally tried to save her friends every chance she got. She learned about Freddy and his powers and made a plan to bring him into the real world and take him out through the booby traps she set up for him. She literally said to Freddy that she wanted the wands with him and was scrapping with him in the bushes. Yet she is overlooked as the final girl to have changed the game on what a final girl can be. She brought the fight to a supernatural slasher, not a human one, a supernatural one. And she did that while running on stay awake pills and coffee. And would you look at that, this is another Wes Craven hood classic. So I ask you, why is Nancy looked over as the final girl who changed the game for final girls? If you compare her character to Sydney, yes, she technically did take out the slashers in her film and she fought back. However, they were human. And technically, though Sydney did fight, she fought to get away until she had no choice but to take out Billy and Stu, while Nancy ran towards the danger in most of the film and faced Freddy head on even when she didn't know what was going on. She didn't show a lot of fear in her very first encounter with Freddy. So according to the audience's standards, should Nancy be given that credit as the final girl to have changed the game and given her flowers for being one of the final girls to not be that damsel in distress? She literally cussed out her boyfriend for going to sleep on the job. But hold on, I might just have an answer as to why Nancy was overlooked. Ah yes, the franchise that put out a slasher film almost every year since the original film in 1980, and also a franchise that is recognized throughout mainstream media as being a part of the big four of slashers within the genre, the Friday the 13th franchise. Now, I've mentioned Friday the 13th franchise a lot throughout this video so far, and that's because in my personal opinion, Friday the 13th is one of the most well-known franchises to come out of the slasher genre. People who don't even watch horror films and slashers know who Jason Voorhees is. That's why in Scream, in the opening scene, Casey gets the wrong answer about Jason being the villain in the first film. It's a common misconception if you're not into horror films. So because of this, franchise being the most known, it's what people most associate with slashers and how they are regardless of what came before and what comes after. And this franchise, regardless of how much it's loved, has misogyny, probably some of the most misogyny I've seen come out of the slasher genre. But then again, there are plenty of slasher films that were made to exploit this genre even more, especially during the 80s. So I'll say out of the big four instead. This franchise run in the 80s is probably what led to what people would expect out of slasher and horror films, and probably the creation of the final girl trope, since the term was coined by Carol J. Clover in 1992. Now, with that being said, two things can be true at once, and I believe it had misogyny and treated women characters really weird. However, I also feel the final girls and those rules mentioned in Scream by Randy aren't as prevalent as they seem. Though I will agree that the leads in most slasher films are blonde white women as the final girls. You'll get black and brown hair in there from time to time, but that's one detail from the final girl that was and is very consistent. So yeah, because Friday the 13th is a franchise that most people can recognize, then people are going to associate whatever that franchise does with the slasher genre as a whole, despite the fact that they don't fall into the trope constantly either. Back to Casey. I feel that Casey is a representation of part of the audience that loves movies but allows them to be what they are and enjoy them, while Billy and Stu are part of the audience that has an intense passion, so much so to the point where it can be toxic. Think about it for a second. They quiz Casey on different horror films, testing if she knows the correct answers, and if she answers wrong, she dies. I mean, of course, plot-wise, they were going to take her out anyway, but I thought that was really interesting. Also, another thing to point out is that the opening scene that is well known and revered by horror audiences only works because of the audience's expectations and the audience having this assumption about slasher films. She's famous and blonde, so she won't be taken out when that is in fact what happened. And what I feel was done to already let the audience know this is not going to be a viewing you can use slasher tropes and bias to predict, so just sit back and enjoy the ride. This was my analysis on Scream and the theme that I saw within this film. Now, before you type in those comments, this is just my opinion and observation on Scream and the slasher and horror genre as a whole. I like to talk about and analyze my thoughts and how I feel about certain things, especially when it comes to slasher films. So don't take it as though what I'm saying can actually change the history of this film and Wes Craven's reasons behind this film that he has probably talked about. Like I said, I just like to look at things from a really different angle and talk about it because I think it's fun to overanalyze things or analyze things in different perspectives from time to time. To sum it up, I feel that because the audience hears the tropes of slasher and horror films along with the misogyny that is presented often, it causes the audience to be very critical of said slasher and horror films, causing them to come in with an expectation and criticism ready. It comes from a love and passion for film, however, that can lead to hurting the viewing experience and turning it into something not so fun. And I feel that's the thing that I see when it comes to Scream, released in 1996. Also, two things can be true at once. I feel the slasher genre is a really cool genre that shows that a female lead can survive and defeat the big bad that no one else can, while also acknowledging the lack of representation in final girls that it has and the misogyny towards the women in the films. Thank y'all so much for watching, and I hope y'all enjoyed it. Remember to keep it kind. Peace.